All right, so let's start this broadcast with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. Now remember, leaders are judged not just by their successes, but also by their failures. And it gets even worse when the political fires are lit by oneself. Or they could even go further by digging their own diplomatic trenches. We're talking about the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Back at home, Justin Trudeau is under immense pressure due to his declining popularity. Now, add to that the recent uproar over the Parliament Speaker honouring a former Nazi soldier with a standing ovation. The Speaker, Anthony Rota, has resigned, but Justin Trudeau is still facing a barrage of questions over this incident. Our next report tells you more.
Canada and its growing reputation as a place, as a safe haven for terrorists, for extremists.
Has there ever been a greater diplomatic embarrassment in the history of our country?
The Speaker of the House took the fall, and the Prime Minister continues to blame everyone else.
The days when a few nations set the agenda and expected others to fall in line are over.
It's crises galore for the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Battling one problem after another, the leader is under intense pressure for failing to provide any proof a week after his controversial accusation. Last week, Trudeau accused New Delhi of involvement in the killing of a Khalistani terrorist. This has irked New Delhi, as it should, but that's not all. On the domestic front, his popularity is plunging. And now there's another diplomatic firestorm over honouring a Nazi soldier in the Parliament. But true to his style of deflecting blame, the Canadian Prime Minister first blamed the Russians and later made the House Speaker resign.
This was deeply embarrassing for the House and for Canada. It is a good thing that Speaker Rota apologized personally, and I'm sure he's reflecting now on how to ensure the dignity of the House going forward.
But hold on, let's look at these images again. Justin Trudeau was very much present then, giving a standing ovation in the House of Commons. Trudeau is under intense pressure from the opposition for shirking responsibilities.
Says he's not responsible for our diplomatic reputation, even though that is precisely the job of the head of government. Like when he says he's not responsible for the inflationary spending that led prices and interest rates to rise faster than at any time in history. He's not responsible for housing costs doubling after he promised to lower them. He's not responsible for dressing up in racist costumes so many times he can't remember. That's all Canadians that needed to learn a lesson from his personal conduct. And now he says he's not responsible to vet the very people that come into contact with a visiting head of state. Is it that he's not responsible or that he's irresponsible?
Canada's Nazigate scandal has snowballed beyond its control. House of Commons Speaker Anthony Rota's resignation from his post has failed to contain the growing criticism Canada is facing across the globe.
The Speaker of the House took the fall, and the Prime Minister continues to blame everyone else. A full-blown international embarrassment for our country, for our allies, and for everything this nation did to defeat the Nazis. An actual Nazi invited to the House of Commons, welcomed and celebrated as a hero, and a government that vetted everyone here. Shame. The PM has called Canadian citizens Nazis. Will he muster the courage and stand up on his feet today and take responsibility?
Yaroslav Hunka served in the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS during the Second World War. The SS, or Schutzstaffel, was the armed unit of Hitler's Nazi party. Right before the end of the Second World War, the 14th Grenadier Division was renamed as the 1st Ukrainian Division. Members of the division were accused of killing Jewish and Polish civilians. But after the war, around 600 of its troops were allowed to settle in Canada. There was fierce opposition against letting the Nazi veterans inside from the Canadian Jewish Congress at the time. But the warnings were ultimately ignored, as the division soldiers had volunteered not because of a love for the Germans, but because of their hatred for the Russians and the communist tyranny. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
All right, now to give us more perspective on this, we're being joined by Mr. Phil Gursky, a former CSI's senior terrorism analyst, who's joining us live from Ontario in Canada. Now, Mr. Gursky, let me in fact begin by asking you with what in fact has happened in the Parliament, which resulted in the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament who ended up losing his job. A former member of the SS, essentially a part of the Nazis, was in fact feted inside the Canadian Parliament with a standing ovation. The Speaker has, of course, taken the fall for it. But can Justin Trudeau not take accountability for what has happened?
Well, I mean, this is obviously something that's beyond my expertise and my experience, but one would assume that if a government issues an invitation to anyone to appear before Parliament, there are bodies and mechanisms in place to make sure that those people should be there, that there's no threat, for example, to the Houses of Parliament, and that people who are invited to be feted, to be honored or whatever, are deserving of those accolades. So at some point, someone has to take responsibility for the inability to vet this person properly. And I think at the end of the day, whether it's right or not, or fair or not, that responsibility rests with the head of government, which in Canada is the Prime Minister.
Absolutely, indeed. That's the political part of, in fact, what's happened within the Canadian Parliament. But let's also talk about the killing of Niger, and also the allegation that's been levelled by the Canadian Prime Minister and what has happened with the investigation since. One of the reports that's been doing the round in terms of the killing of Niger is that was filed by Washington Post, which has come up with some extraordinary details, claiming that it had seen a 90-second video, a CCTV footage in which Niger was in fact killed in a very coordinated and sophisticated manner. And since then, we've heard very little from the Canadian police. Are there question marks, do you think, that are being raised about the investigation that is being done in the aftermath of the killing?
I have a lot of friends in law enforcement, and I think that when information of this nature is released by a politician for whatever political gain, it puts law enforcement and, by extension, security intelligence, like the agency I used to work for, under a great deal of pressure. We like to do our jobs to the best of our ability. We don't like to be held under the microscope. We like to have the time to confirm the information that we have, to collect other information that supports or does not support. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to decide is, do you have enough knowledge to draw a conclusion? So as you mentioned, these are serious allegations. Does the intelligence support it? Perhaps. But one important thing to remind your viewers or listeners is that in Canada, at least, intelligence is not evidence. It's not collected to the same standard and can't be used in a criminal court. What we have so far are allegations that intelligence was collected. That's highly problematic in the Canadian system.
And are you also a bit surprised that, when this video footage of about 90 seconds, this is said to be a CCTV footage, this was, accessed first by Washington Post, an American media portal, and not someone within the Canadian media? Does that surprise you?
I'm not sure what it indicates. I'm assuming that the footage was from the Gurdwara itself. I don't see where else it could have come from.
Right.
We don't have CCTV in Canada to the extent they have in the United Kingdom, for example. So I'm going to assume that the Gurdwara, for whatever reason, decided to share this footage with the Washington Post as opposed to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation or local media. The decision to do that is beyond my understanding. But
the reason why
why
I brought that up, Mr. Gursky, is because what is also being reported very widely is, besides, apart from Canadian intelligence agencies, the intelligence agency of one of the other Five Eyes was also in the know of the incident that has happened. So the question that I want to ask you is it possible that this is something that's been, the information that's been shared by the intelligence agency of one of the other Five Eyes with the Washington Post?
It's a great comment, and I've seen the same statements that you have, that in fact it maybe was the Americans. So for your viewers and listeners, the Five Eyes is the Anglosphere of intelligence. Has been around since the end of the Second World War. It is the gold standard of intelligence sharing as far as I'm concerned, and I was obviously part of the Five Eyes. This puts a tremendous amount of pressure on one of the allies because, again, you do not want intelligence to be released in the public sphere because of the way it's collected. And when this information is betrayed publicly, it can affect sources and methods, and you can lose that source of information. So it's rarely a good day when intelligence is shared openly because it affects the way we do our jobs.
Absolutely, indeed. And one last quick comment that I would want from you is, in the report that was put out by the Washington Post, it was suggested that the RCMP and the Surrey police, in fact, had a bit of an argument about whose jurisdiction it actually was. Later, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has come forth and said that there was no argument whatsoever about the question of jurisdiction and that the investigation has actually happened as it should. But the fact is we've heard very little from the Canadian police as to what, in fact, has happened in the course of the investigation. Do you think the Canadian police has been very economical in terms of the amount of information that it has put out in public domain?
Well, there's some background to this. So a couple of months ago, the mayor of Surrey, which is a city south of Vancouver, and his city council decided to recreate the Surrey Municipal Police. So in Canada, in many cities, the RCMP has municipal police jurisdiction and responsibilities. In this case, Surrey's decided to, no longer use the RCMP and to recreate the Surrey Police. Although I understand now that may be reversed again. So it's a bit of an up in the air situation in Surrey, which may account for the dispute, shall we say, or lack of agreement on whose jurisdiction obtains with respect to the murder of Mr. Najjar in Surrey.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Guski, for joining us and getting us all those details then.
My pleasure. Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.